What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. I literally played 14 hours of the new patch of Marvel Snap. Here are my favorite decks for day one in the new meta. I personally believe that the most important deck to start out with is, of course, the Bounce deck. After all, Toxin did just come out, and we are still seeing a lot of reactions to Toxin's release. A bunch of people playing the Bounce deck, a bunch of people teching against the Bounce deck. I'm not convinced it's necessarily the best deck in the game right now, but it doesn't have to be the best deck in the game in order to be one that is played enough to majorly impact the meta. This is what happens when new cards come out, especially when a patch like the one that just happened ends up making the versions of Agent Venom decks that play Shadow King a little bit stronger. You'll notice there's no Shadow King in this build. That's not because it's incorrect to run it, but instead because this is the most generic build of the deck. This is not necessarily an endorsement of this build. There are several flex slots. You can play Werewolf by Night instead of Bishop. You cut Iceman for Shadow King. You can play Sage instead of Bishop. There's a bunch of different flexible things you can do, but this is what I would describe as the base shell of Bounce. It's probably not going to be what many high-level players specifically are playing, but this should give you an idea of what you can and cannot get away with changing. To me, Bounce is a very powerful archetype, and my brain kind of prefers when I can just play the cards out without having to worry about stuff like that. But it is my opinion that Shadow King is a remarkably powerful card right now, and you probably should run it when you play Bounce. If you are going to cut a card for SK in this list, I strongly suspect that it is Iceman. Now, there are some budget considerations. I do not think you want to be playing Bounce without Agent Venom. I also kind of don't think you're going to want to be playing Bounce without Toxin. Because Toxin just came out, all these decks are Toxin Bounce decks, and I don't think she's the kind of card that you can actually get out of the deck. So for those who complain a lot about the game being pay to win, I think this deck specifically, Agent Venom and Toxin, are actually required cards. When you look at the other cards in the deck, I think they can be a lot more replaceable. Something like Silver Sable can just be replaced with Shadow King straight up, which is really effectively just replacing Silver Sable with Iceman because a lot of these decks should be running Shadow King anyway. But I think from there you can sort of see that, like, outside of those cards, it's really a fairly cheap deck with an archetype build around in the form of Toxin that's actually pretty easy to grasp and pick up. This is a powerful deck, and I think we all know what really matters with this list. The one thing you're going to really want to keep an eye out for are the people who are countering you. Speaking as someone who was playing a decent amount of those counter decks with Invisible Woman and Killmonger, I got absolutely blown out by someone running Kyera in their Bounce deck. I'm not saying I recommend it, but I am saying it worked on me. And there's a lot of stuff in this metagame that rotates around the matchups that Bounce has versus other decks. Because this deck is able to go so tall, it's able to effectively sort of bully decks that can't go tall enough. And if they don't have the right interaction, it's actually very, very hard for them to win. So the metagame tends to revolve around having that correct interaction. That's the baseline for this metagame, and that's why Bounce is first on the list in this video. I expect this list to be a bit of a surprise to many people. It was cooked up by Revis, and it has been endorsed by Stefan, the guy for Supergiant stuff. This is a list that, instead of using what I think you could reasonably describe as a bad card in the form of Ronin as your big points guy, is instead using good cards like Ajax as your big points package. The thing that Supergiant is able to execute in this metagame is not just the fact that it is extremely powerful to have full knowledge of what your opponent is doing while they have no knowledge of what you're doing thanks to Daredevil's Supergiant. It's not even just that you are able to use that knowledge to play cards like Negasonic, Teenage Warhead, and Cosmo as basically snipers. It's not even that. It's also that we are in a metagame where a lot of decks have a setup turn on turn 5. That's just the truth right now. There are so many decks, from Sera to Bounce to Discard, that are really trying to, like, actually play the card on turn 5 and have that card impact their turn 6. All the Bounce decks are trying to, like, bounce stuff on turn 5. The Sera decks would love to play Sera on turn 5. The Discard decks want to play MODOK on turn 5. I'm sure you can think of a couple other examples of where Supergiant is a meaningfully impactful card in those situations. That is a lot of why this deck makes sense. It's not just Cosmo Negasonic sniping stuff. It's not just Ajax is a good card. It's also that there is genuinely unique utility here because a lot of the Agent Venom decks really want their turn 5 play to be visible on the board. And that is to say nothing of the horrific stuff you can get up to if you have Daredevil and Supergiant against one of those Iron Man decks. If they play an Iron Man, you can actually just blow it up with Negasonic a lot of the time. It is just gross. And that is what this deck is trying to leverage. It's the combination of Supergiant's effect being pretty good in this metagame and Daredevil Supergiant allowing this stuff to just be very, very overpowered. But I want you to know that it's not just a gimmick, and frankly, this deck is actually reasonably hard to play, in my opinion. I have a lot of trouble mathing out my turns. It feels like a lot of the time it's like, okay, I'm not really sure what happens here. There's confusing interactions. I need to know a lot about how priority works, and I need to be able to plan for that. It's a hard deck to play in a different way than something like Bounce is a hard deck to play. And I think that that makes it a rewarding experience to learn, and it's why there are so few true Supergiant mains. It's just difficult. You'll be shocked to learn that this deck is still good. Now, what is exactly going on with this deck is actually pretty interesting to me. When you look at the stats on Untapped, this deck's stats are about as bad as they've been in ever. And that's not to say like it's bad or anything like that, but it is like notably lower than the 58, 59% that it was consistently putting up with large sample size in High Infinite over the last few weeks. I'm not really sure why that is. I genuinely can't figure it out. I don't really know. Maybe it's the buff to Shadow King actually doing more than we thought. Maybe it's Toxin making Bounce more of an actual threat to beat this deck. Those are kind of my guesses right now, where previously I feel like the matchup was very clearly in favor of this deck. Now with Toxin, it's possible that the Bounce deck is actually just outputting more points unless you are getting like the 4-power Iron Man. It does feel like when you're playing this deck against Bounce, basically everything is just who had Agent Venom, and then if one of you had Agent Venom and the other one didn't, like you can play a game, but you're gonna be unfavored in it. And I think that that dynamic is very strong, actually. It doesn't feel as strong as it is, but I can count on like one hand the amount of games I've won where in an Agent Venom mirror where they had Agent Venom on too and I didn't. It's not common, but you can always make them close. And I think that's actually like part of the appeal of Agent Venom and part of why they seem so reticent to nerf it, because this card is not blindingly, overpoweringly ridiculous. You're usually able to put them in like a Reed 50-50 situation, but they also seem to win a lot. So it's like, all right, you know, how good is this card actually? The answer is still very good. How good is this deck actually? I strongly suspect the answer is still very, very good. A lot of it is down to actually having Agent Venom. There are more competitors in terms of point ceiling right now. And there are a lot of weird decks, like the Sera decks, that are really trying to leverage things and beat the Bounce deck, but also incidentally are pretty good into you. Decks playing Rogue, decks playing Killmonger, just stuff that hits what you're doing. And so you do have to be careful about coping into those decks. And I actually also think that the Claw nerf kind of mattered. I'm not going to be like, oh my god, it's the biggest deal in the world. But frankly, playing this, it felt like a bigger deal than I thought it would ever be. I hope you missed turn 4 Professor X, because that's what we're doing in Aurashem now. With the addition of Storm being an actual reasonably big card, this deck now has some absolute nightmare openers that are just really deeply unpleasant. Obviously, like, there are ways to get around this stuff. Professor X is not necessarily a lockdown card. Storm is not necessarily a lockdown card. But there are a lot of decks against which these cards are exactly what you think they are. Yes, there is also the War Machine combo in here. No, you're probably not going to pull it off. But if you do, I mean, you can, right? Like, you can do 3, 4, 5 on that. You are allowed to do that as an Aurashem deck. It's just vanishingly unlikely. You are trying to play a lockdown game plan and attempt at dealing with the variety of bounce decks in the game right now. Like, Storm on 3 is actually really good into a lot of the Agent Venom decks because they're not equipped to put power there immediately. These are normally decks that, like, they've already played their Fina out, probably, right? And so they're just not really equipped to deal with that. And then once that's happened, you really just need to win one other lane and figure out how you're going to do that. And so you have Professor X on 4, you have Storm on 3. One of the things that really strikes me about playing this deck is figuring out whether your opponent is going to commit to the Storm or not. Because I do think that that is like really the linchpin of your Storm game plans, is if you can get away with not playing on the Storm because they think that they can't compete with you there, it is so much easier to win that other lane. I'm not saying you always get to do that, but it is something that really stood out to me as, like, if you make that read correctly, it is so overpoweringly good. But it's a very hard read to actually make, and I'm not sure I would be able to say how often you should be making a read like that. As for the rest of this deck, it's your normal RSM soup. We're playing a bunch of good cards. Wow, I'm shocked. We are playing a bunch of things that are good against the things opponents are playing. So we got Man-Thing in there because we're trying to beat up on bounce decks, and that's like a 415 against the bounce decks, right? Like, that's really all that's going on here. Is the deck is the same, except also we're trying to scam people with Prof X and Storm. And when you're not doing that, I mean, when RSM isn't doing what it wants to do, this might be the worst deck in the game. This is a very variance-heavy deck, and I do think that, like, this is the kind of deck where it's like, I don't care how many times you play it. Like, if I see a comment that's like, I played your RSM deck and I went 2 and 5 and deleted it, it's like, yeah, man, that happens. That's RSM. There's no such thing as an RSM deck that isn't going to do that some of the time. That's just how the deck works. One of my personal favorite archetypes, Agent Venom Sera. I feel like AV Sera is reasonably well equipped to handle most issues the metagame will throw at it, and that means that it does have some unique vulnerability to rogue decks. There are things, not the card rogue, but I mean rogue decks as in off meta. There are things that can just, like, totally invalidate this. The Super Giant deck just, like, really hurts this deck a lot of the time. But what really makes this deck actually tick is, like, and I really can't stress this enough. Agent Venom Mysterio is just messed up. It's just a messed up thing to do. That is a 1 energy, 12 power guy. It's messed up. If you get Gwenpool buffs on it, it's even more messed up. That is just fundamentally what this deck is about. Your Agent Venoms are so much better when Mysterio is in the deck. You are, like, often actively sad to see Agent Venom and Mysterio in your opening hand, because you play the Agent Venom and, like, basically every other card in the deck does not get a huge buff from it. This is not a bounce deck where, like, all the cards are getting, like, 2 or 3 off of it. You are getting some pretty minimal buffs. Like, it's really here for Mysterio, and because, you know, it's a 2/4 and we like cards that we can play early, and this archetype does kind of need to be able to curve out a decent amount of the time. You're never going to be mad at a 2/4. But, like, it's really mostly here for Mysterio. And I think that that dynamic is a little bit understated. I don't really think people grasp that, but, like, when you look at the deck, like, actually really look at it, Mysterio is why we're playing this card. And it's a good enough reason, right? Like, that's the really powerful thing. But if you're talking about aggressively snapping your turn 2 Agent Venom, all I'll say is make sure your Mysterio is actually in the deck, because your Agent Venoms are not as good as other decks' Agent Venoms unless you have that card. Just straight up. Every other Agent Venom deck has a better Agent Venom than you. Your advantage over them is that you have this Invisible Woman Killmonger stuff, you have this Rogue stuff, you have the Shadow King stuff. You're fully teched out to beat the other Agent Venom decks, but their Agent Venoms do more for them than yours does for you. I can't be sure that this is the best Scream list right now, but I think that you are able to play this deck. It's the same that it's been for a while. When you draw Scream on 2, you really beat people up. When you don't draw Scream on 2, your power output is really lacking. And the real thing that makes this deck make sense is the variety of scams that it has in addition to Scream on 2. So, like, your best draws are all Scream on 2, and then you scam a lane closed or something, basically. Like, that's really all that's happening here. You scam a lane closed, you juggernaut them, you scam, you scam, you scam. This deck is full of scams. You close a lane off with Polaris, you get some minus points with Kingpin, you get some minus points with Scream, suddenly they're looking at a bunch of awful stuff. you're scamming, right? Like that's really what's happening here. And then your end game is usually an unexpected Magneto, an unexpected Arrow, an unexpected Juggernaut, an unexpected Cannonball. You get what's happening here, right? Like this is not a deck that keeps up by virtue of point output. It's a deck that has enough point output to be a threat and then tries to scam its way out of the fact that it can't really go over the top of most of these decks. There's some really fun stuff you can do when playing against a bounce deck if you have all your little movers early, because like you just get to be like, look at that lane you're setting up. Oh, nope, you're not setting that up. Or, oh, that bishop, it's in that lane you beasted now. Like you can do stuff. You have all these little tricks and it's hard to play against you and there's a bunch of little weird things you can do, but fundamentally you are still doing weird things. You are not outputting as many points as your opponents are in many cases, and so you need to get them, is basically what I'm saying. The way you play this deck is you try to get people. You want them to be like, oh my god, are you serious? That's what this deck is a factory of. It is a factory of ugh, and you need to make your opponent go, ugh. Oh, of course the Spider-Man. You need to make them sound like me on a Twitch stream, okay? You need to make your opponent salty because that's what this deck is actually about. Other than that, it is a fairly subpar mid-range deck. If it wasn't doing that stuff, like it would have respectable points, but not overwhelming points. But the fact that it has so many cards that can change the math on every turn of the game and make your predictions unpredictable, I guess, is what makes it an actual functional deck. This is the reverse of that. It's a deck I like to call Stop Doing Things, and your goal is basically to Cosmo and Eliath your way through your opponent's deck and prevent them from doing any of the stuff that they actually want to do. This deck's a little finicky. Your good draws are really unbelievably good. You have a bunch of absolutely bonkers, amazing draws where you just draw everything in the right order. You have your Madam Web. It doesn't get Red Guardianed. You have your payoffs for your Madam Web. And then you have these games where you just like have no cards to play, where it's all payoffs or all enablers. And you're just sitting there looking at the deck like this is 100% unplayable. And that is the cost of the Storm nerf, right? Like this was a deck previously that would have been a Storm War Machine Legion deck. That was a very common thing. And I do think that it does get dinged a little bit because of that. The upsides, though, are fairly huge. We get to bring Heimdall back in, which is actually a pretty big deal because you are able to be very unpredictable with him. Now, I am making a video on it. Maybe it won't be so unpredictable in the future. I did win a game against a move deck by saying, oh, they're Heimdalling me. I'll play around the Heimdall that's very clearly telegraphed, and then they did that, and it's like, that's a pretty common dynamic with move decks is Heimdall in to lose. But that's not to say that he's not a card worth including, just that you have to really think hard about what you're supposed to do with the guy. And I think that is... It's really easy to just slam him and not think, but you need to actually math out your points on all three locations and then what your opponent is likely to do. And then, like, are you able to get a Cosmo near your big threats so you don't get Shadow King? Because everyone's playing Shadow King. And then you realize you're probably just better off Eliathing a lot of the time anyway. But that said, the deck is still good. It is still doing what you want it to do. The power of the move package remains high. The consistency, unfortunately, remains a little bit low. And you don't really get to replace the Storm War Machine Legion stuff, which was your backup consistency plan, with more consistency, because there aren't any other move payoffs that you could actually be running that aren't ass, right? And so that leaves you in a spot where, like, you have these cards in here now, Heimdall and Copycat, and, like, they're not bad, but they're not what the deck needs, right? And so that can feel a little bit awkward, where there's just like a little bit of just air. Your draws are air. You have like a hand of cards, and none of them are Human Torch and Dagger and Vulture, and you're kind of just sort of sitting there and not making any actual plays. That's a risk now. It's real. Discard also remains functional. It's not necessarily a bad deck or even a good deck. It's just a deck. You can play it. It is solid. To my mind, I have it a little bit above Destroy and Zoo, but not necessarily all that above it. And it's sort of like the representative of the decks that build themselves tier. I think that Destroy and Zoo are also perfectly acceptable. You can absolutely do that, and feel free to do whatever you want with them. But I will say that this is a powerful deck that doesn't necessarily actually have, you know, it doesn't necessarily actually have the juice to compete with the good draws from AV decks, which is a lot of decks have that issue. This deck can do it, but it needs to actually have the good draws. And so you end up with a deck that is similar in point output. It's higher than the Scream deck, but it doesn't have as much, scam ability on it. And the bad draws are really bad, and the good draws are really good, but they're not necessarily good enough for you to feel confident snapping because there's so much interaction for the stuff that you can do. A lot of rogues, a lot of red guardians, even some Mobiuses. This is a good deck, but I wouldn't get too attached to it. And finally, this is, of course, a day one decks list, so what would it be without the worst deck of all time cooked up by my good friend Butt? This is, for those who are not familiar with Butt, he's a high-level player, but he has this weird obsession with M'Baku and Blink. It's called The Combo, and it's been played in a variety of different situations, but this is the most recent. Now, normally, I'm not in the business of putting what looks like completely unplayable garbage on my day one deck lists. Normally, I have more respect for myself than that. However, here's what I will say. He beat me with this deck like 5 times. Like, I'm not saying that's hard. I lose a lot of games, right? Like, it's just, like LeBron has the most missed shots in NBA history. It happens, right? But this is a deck that people will be like, what the hell is happening? I don't know what this is. And you will scam the hell out of people with this. Like, there's some really cool stuff you can do with this. Also, I want to point out that, like, the dream with this deck is not to actually pull off the combo. The dream with this deck is to have a have a Death's Domain, right? And then Galactus the Death's Domain, and then M'Baku jumps out of the deck in order to win you the Death's Domain. That's what this deck really wants you to do. That's what this deck is really trying to do. But all seriousness, Electro Galactus stuff is actually pretty strong. There's a lot of stacking power on here that makes your Galactus's power unpredictable. You have Symbiote Spider-Man Galactus. You have a lot of just like, this deck is very good at making your opponents second guess themselves. And so you are able to just put a lot of threat onto the board in a way that a lot of decks are not really prepared to deal with. Bounce decks, Sera decks are really hard up when it comes to dealing with this, and so you end up in very bad situations a decent amount of the time. I'm not saying this deck is good, but you probably will have a blast playing it, and I did want to get it out there. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. I have been KM Best. I hope you enjoyed the day one decks, and I will see you in the next one. Y'all have a great one. Remember to like and subscribe.